The jury meeting together on February 27th, 2023, in the headquarters of the BBVA Foundation in Madrid, Spain, in order to deliberate and decide, has resolved to grant the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award in the Economics, Finance, and Management category in its 15th edition to the following candidates: Tim Besley, Torsten Persson, and Guido Tabellini, for their work in illuminating the connection between the political and economic worlds.
What innovations has modern political economy contributed to economics?
I think there's sort of two elements to that. The first one is a better understanding of how policies that we see get chosen and how that relates to the institutional environment in which they're determined, whether they're determined, for example, in a democratic policy setting or a non-democratic setting. It gives us a better understanding of where policies come from. The second thing is it gives us a sense of what makes policy work effectively. What are the preconditions for policies to actually achieve the goals of those policies? And I think we've really created a much better understanding within economics now of how policies both emerge and become effective.
What are the political drivers of fiscal cycles?
So political cycles emanate from the fact that there's decision-making, particularly in democracies, is governed by an electoral process, and therefore we see political cycles around when elections are occurring. But also some elections have different features. For example, it may be that the incumbent that makes decisions in this electoral cycle can't stand for office again. And in some of my early work on the United States, I looked at governors in the US states that could or could not be re-elected. And in that work with Ann Case, we found that electoral cycles could be related to the political incentives of the incumbent governors.
What factors determine state capacity, and what importance does this have to understand why some countries develop more than others for both an economic and institutional standpoint?
So in my work with Torsten Persson, we identify state capacity as the bedrock, if you like, on the basis of which effective government policy is determined. What drives state capacity is having a way of creating common interests around the need to create states that serve the interests of all citizens, not just particular groups, for example, ruling elites. We argue that that's very important to understanding levels of development, because without a strong and effective state, there are many things that government cannot do to support the welfare of the citizens of the country they govern. And so we see state capacities built on the back of common interests as a very central driver of why some states become effective and therefore can support meaningful economic development. Not just economic development that raises incomes, but economic development that distributes the benefits of that growth across a wide spectrum of citizens through investing in public programs.
How would you define modern political economy, and what role should empirical evidence play in the field of research?
Well, modern political economy, as many people call it, is a field of research that sort of has its roots in work that some of us did in the 1990s and 2000s. And it takes a step away from the traditional economic approach, which sort of stops at analyzing how economic policy making affects the economy. Here, the next step, if you like, is to ask how economic policy itself gets done. And the answer very, very broadly, is that economic and political forces together shape economic policy in a systematic fashion.
In what ways can economic growth be negatively affected by inequality according to your research?
The first paper we wrote on how economic growth and inequality hang together was from the 1990s, and this is my joint work with Guido Tabellini, a co-recipient of the prize, where we emphasized how when some people are worse off, and much worse off than the majority, then they may want to ask for a lot of redistributive policies. These redistributive policies could come in the form of taxes or other interventions that one way or another hit investors, and investors are less keen to do their thing, then economic growth will go down. So that's one mechanism. Another mechanism, which is more sort of emphasized in my joint work with Tim Besley 10 or 15 years later, is about how inequality can foster political violence, and when there is a lot of political violence, either by the government or between various groups in society, then that's also not a great environment for people to invest, and growth can suffer as a result.
To what extent does a country's institutional structure determine economic policies, and can it even have a greater influence than the ideology of the governing party?
I would say so. The governing parties come and go, but the institutions tend to be much more sticky. And a particular interest here would be political institutions. So is the country governed by a presidential regime, or is it governed by a parliament? Are politicians elected by plurality rule like they are in the US or the UK, or are they elected by proportional representation as in many other countries? These are examples of institutions that map systematically into different economic policy outcomes. So I would say yes, it's more important than ideology.
How has empirical research shaped the modern political economy, and why is this field so crucial to understand the connections between the economic and political worlds?
So empirical research has become more important in economics over time, and political economics has followed this trend. Early on, empirical research in political economics was mostly comparing different countries ruled by different political institutions. More recently, the emphasis of the research has been on studying individual behavior, individual politicians, individual voters, and understanding what motivates politicians and how individual voters form their political opinions. And this kind of research is key to understand how policy decisions are made, reflecting the political incentives of politicians and the demand of voters in society.
How do features of political structures such as the parliamentary system or electoral majorities influence economic policies such as taxation, redistributive programs, or public good provision?
So in a democracy, there is a key distinction between institutions that concentrate political power in a single party, as in majoritarian electoral systems, or a single individual, as in a presidential regime, versus institutions that diffuse power among several parties or several groups. This distinction is important because it shapes the incentives of governments. When there is a single party in government with concentrated incentives, typically the policy is efficient from an economic point of view, but the benefits are directed towards a subset of the population. Institutions that instead diffuse power, like a proportional parliamentary system, tend to have policies that please many people, so public good provision is enhanced because it benefits all, at the expenses of inefficiencies, because coalition governments tend to spend more than single-party governments, and their policies are intertemporally less efficient. We accumulate more public debt, larger deficits in such systems.
What is the relationship between identity politics, economic shocks, and polarization? What interrelations has your research revealed between culture, politics, and economy?
So we all have multiple social identities. I am Italian, I am an economics professor, I belong to a certain age group. Which of these identity prevails at a given point in time is important because it shapes my view of the world. And social psychology has revealed that social identity exasperates conflicts between the in-group and the out-group. It has also revealed that which identity prevails depends on which which issues are more salient in society at a given point in time. In the past, in the 60s and 70s, the salient conflict was over economic redistribution between individuals who belong to different economic classes, working class versus upper class. And that led to polarization over economic redistribution. Now, because of globalization and technology, the salient divide has more to do with education than with income. And the division is between highly educated individuals and less educated individuals. But education shapes our view of the world on many issues, like our attitudes towards immigration, race relations. And so these new salient shocks have created a cultural divide between conservative and progressives on issues like immigration, civil rights, and race relations. And that's a result of changing social identities.